Talking about the Jacksonian era in America, this is a really interesting time period because we still see Jacksonian era politics today, and it's among the Democratic Party. The ironic thing about Andrew Jackson is a lot of people compare him and his personality and his political awareness to that of President Trump today, although they're actually members of the opposite party. They show a lot of similarities as far as not being overly political aware, maybe not being polished, that type of thing. There's a lot of comparisons between these two guys, and you'll probably figure it out maybe better as we get through. But our first subtopic is going to be Andrew Jackson, the man. We're just going to tell you about Andrew Jackson in general because he's a very interesting person. Okay, first of all, he was born on the frontier in 1767. He was born on the frontier. Where would the frontier be at this time? Lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. So he was born on the frontier in 1767. His parents immigrated from Northern Ireland. So he's Irish. Okay, so his parents immigrate from Northern Ireland, and he's born on the western frontier in 1767. Now he grew up on the Waxhaw region of the Carolina frontier. If you look at Carolina, this whole thing here was one colony, right? At the time, one area. And he lived on the western half by the Appalachian Mountains. So this was considered frontier land at the time. So he lived in what they called the Waxhaw, it's on your ID sheet, the Waxhaw region of the Carolina frontier. And he had no formal schooling growing up. No formal schooling whatsoever. So he grew up in the Waxhaw region of the Carolina frontier. No formal schooling. And people made fun of him when he was a young fellow because he couldn't spell at all. Even when he was president, he would spell the same thing 6 different times in a document. He was a very poor speller his whole life. And when he was a young boy, they used to make fun of him because he couldn't spell. Now in 1781, during the Revolutionary War, Jackson was just 14 years old. He was just 14. And he and his older brother were serving as couriers for the Continental Army. What does that mean? If you're a courier. Deliver messages. So he's 14 years old in 1781 during the Revolutionary War. Here he and his brother Robert, who was older than he, were working or serving as couriers for the Continental Army. They were taking messages back and forth. Well, he and his brother were forced to hide in a cabin because the British were after them because they discovered they were couriers for the enemy. So they hide in this cabin, but they're soon discovered by British soldiers. And when they caught him, what did they do to him? Captured him and did what? Made him... They were going to take him prisoner of war, was the idea. Okay? Well, one British officer demanded that the young Andrew Jackson clean my boots, and made Jackson angry. You'll find out that Andrew Jackson always had a little bit of a temper. And when this British officer ordered Andrew Jackson in that cabin to clean his boots, he refused and said, quote, "I am a prisoner of war and demand to be treated accordingly." Pretty mature for a 14-year-old when you think about it. So again, Robert and Andrew Jackson are caught by the British for being couriers during the Revolutionary War for the Continental Army. To intimidate the young Jackson, one British officer ordered him to clean my boots. He refused, stating, "I am a prisoner of war and demand to be treated accordingly. Pretty mature statement for a 14-year-old kid. Well, what was the British officer's reaction when he said that? What?
Hit him with the sword.
He did. He got angry and he took a swipe at him with his sword. And what do you do if I take a sword and swipe at you, Carter? Your first reaction is going to be to stick your arm up. And that's what he did. And he caught the sword with his arm, which cut his arm. But the sword also cut the scalp of his head as well. Now, historians will tell you in later life, whenever Andrew Jackson was thinking, he'd always sit there and he would just rub that scar on his head that he had received when he was 14. And because of this incident, Andrew Jackson, for the rest of his life, had a tremendous hatred of the British. Just hated the British. From the time he was 14 till the time he died, which will make a difference when we lecture farther. So the British officer takes a swipe at Jackson with his sword. Jackson puts his arm up to block the sword, the blow of the sword. It cuts his hand and hits the scalp of his head. Well, the two boys were taken to a British prison camp, and you know, we talked about how were those camps? What were they like? Remember? Yeah, they were bad, and they both contracted smallpox while they were prisoners of war. So they're both taken to a British prisoner of war camp, and they both contracted smallpox while there. And they probably both would have died there if it wasn't for their widowed mother, Elizabeth. So both boys are taken to a British prisoner of war camp. They both contract smallpox, and they both probably die there if it's not for their widowed mother, Elizabeth. She had had some tragedy in her life. Her husband was killed in a logging accident before the war. Her oldest son was killed fighting in the Revolutionary War. Now she has her second oldest son and her youngest son having smallpox in a British prisoner of war camp. Not a good thing for poor Elizabeth. So again, her husband was killed in a logging accident before the war. Her oldest son was killed fighting in the Revolutionary War. Now her other two sons are in a British prisoner of war camp with smallpox. Well, what she did is she went to the prisoner of war camp and pled with the British officer who was in charge of the prison camp to release her sons. Okay? So she goes to the British prisoner of war camp, pleads with the British officer in charge, and he agrees to release her sons. Why would he do that? There were two reasons. One, historically documented, the other one, rumor. Why would that officer release those two boys? Why?
Because they're just kids and it make them look bad.
They were young. That was the documented reason he let them go, is because they were of their age. What was another rumored reason?
He wanted to move them off.
What?
I don't know.
Well, nice way, yeah. Here's a good kid. He wants to woo the mom. Nice way of putting it. Rumor.
He more wanted to pull Bill Clinton.
Well, you're getting closer. Yeah, rumor had it that she traded sexual favors for her son's release. Now, this will come back later in Jackson's life when somebody says something about it, which it'll show his temper again. But just keep that in mind. Documents where they were so young. Now, Dash, how do you know all this? Because I'm really curious.
Oh, I know a lot about it.
Well, there you go. Let's see. Well, this is great. Yeah, that was a nice way of putting it. That he wooed the mother, whatever that means. But anyway, you know what the other example was. Okay, we won't have to tell you again. You got it. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, the officer agrees to release the boys historically because of their young age. So they leave the prison camp. Both boys are in grave condition. And they only had one horse. Okay? So they leave the prison camp. Both boys are in grave condition. They only have one horse. So Robert got aboard the horse because he was in worse shape than the younger Andrew, and his mother and Andrew walked all the way back to their home while Robert stayed on aboard the horse because he was sick. He's the older of the two, not the oldest, but the older of the two. So because Robert was in worse condition than Andrew, the younger Jackson walked with his mother as they led the horse, the older brother aboard. And they walked nearly 40 miles back to their home. That's quite a, it doesn't seem like much now when you get in your car, but even driving in tent sleeping back takes some time. Can you imagine walking there and back with two sons basically dying of smallpox, walking with a horse? Well, by the time they got back home, the older boy had died. And for the next 6 months, Elizabeth Jackson struggled to keep Andrew alive. You see, they were both in tough shape. So Robert dies by the time they get back, and Andrew has to be cared for by his mother for almost 6 months to get him out of the woods to keep him from dying. So for the next 6 months, she kept Andrew alive, right? 6 months after that, the mother died of cholera. The mother dies of cholera, making Andrew Jackson an orphan. Okay? So, she takes care of Andrew for 6 months and he pulls through and survives. But 6 months after that, his mother dies of cholera. Now don't write this. Anybody know what cholera is? This would be a horrible, let me read it to you. Don't write it down, just listen. This is what she died of. Cholera is an acute illness caused by infection of the intestine. An estimated 3 to 5 million cases and over 100,000 deaths occur each year around the world. That's today. Okay? The infection is often mild or without symptoms, but can sometimes be severe. Approximately 1 in 10 people infected will have severe disease characterized by profuse watery diarrhea, vomiting, and leg cramps. In these people, rapid loss of body fluids leads to dehydration and shock. Without treatment, death can occur within hours. Okay? This is what this poor woman died of. Okay? So Andrew Jackson is now an orphan. And he goes to relatives, and his mother said on her dying bed that she wanted Andrew to become a minister. So Andrew Jackson's an orphan. He's taken by relatives. His mother pleaded with him to become a minister. He would be the farthest thing from a minister you can imagine, especially right after his mother died. So Andrew Jackson is an orphan. He's taken in by relatives, and his mother desperately wanted him to become a minister. Well, he was far from that. During his teenage years after his mother died, he was considered a hellion. He took part in lots of fights. He was a bad cursor. He drank and smoked tobacco. He was just kind of a hellion. It was not really what his mother would have wanted him to be. Okay? He was what we call a typical high school senior boy or girl today, right? So he was a hellion. Okay? He fought all the time. He cursed all the time. He drank all the time. He chewed tobacco. All the things a young man wasn't supposed to do in his teenage years, Andrew Jackson did. He had no interest in education. He earned money by gambling on horse races and playing dice games. So he had no interest in education. He was just kind of a mess. No interest in education. He didn't have any interest in becoming anything, being anything at all. And all he did was gamble on horse races and dice games. That's what he did. That was his life. Well, there's a lot of kids that get into that mode, and pretty soon you mature and you figure out that, geez, maybe I need to change. Life's getting pretty hard here. So he did mature at the end of his teenage years, and he realized that he had to make a change in his life. He made a decision to better himself, and he wanted more out of life. Now, I tell kids this all the time, especially kids that are struggling in Worland, that graduate from high school, for example, and just can't get a life. What do I tell them to do? Leave. Get out of Worland. Go somewhere else. Get out of your environment. Go see if you can be successful. Well, that's what Andrew Jackson did. He left the Carolina frontier and moved east. He left the Carolina frontier and he moved east. And he decided, believe it or not, that he wanted to become a lawyer. Now, you know how you became a lawyer in those days? Did I ever Yeah, you don't go to law school, you study under another lawyer. And this particular lawyer that Jackson studied under was Spruce McKay. And he did that in North Carolina. So Jackson decides he's had enough of having no life. He realizes his life has to change. He wants to make a decision to better himself. He wants more out of life. So he leaves the Carolina frontier and moves east with the hopes of becoming a lawyer. And he studies law under a very famous attorney by the name of Spruce McKay from North Carolina. One of the best he could have picked, actually. And what he did basically is he simply listened to attorney Spruce McKay. He read the attorney's law library. He learned to prepare wills and legal documents. And he learned all about the legal process itself simply by being, quote, an apprentice to Spruce McKay. He paid attention to what he was doing. He watched him work during the day. He read his law library. He learned from Spruce McKay how to prepare wills, how to prepare legal contracts, what the legal process was itself. And he studied with Spruce McKay for 3 years. And finally, at the age of 20, he was no longer the backwoods frontier boy. He was a polished man that was going to be accepted by upper class people. He was going to become a lawyer. Okay? So, he studies with Spruce McKay for 3 years. And finally, at the age of 20, he has gained respect for himself. He's no longer the backwoods frontier boy, but he's now a polished man who is accepted by upper class people. They don't know anything about his past, do they? Because he moved out of town and decided to better himself. They see him as Andrew Jackson, a fairly polished young man who's a lawyer. Well, in 1788, he moves to Nashville, Tennessee to practice law. In 1788, he moves to Nashville, Tennessee to begin his law practice. Now, Tennessee wasn't a state yet, it was a territory. Just keep that in mind. And he worked incredibly hard, and he became a prosecutor. You had to work to become a prosecutor. Anybody can be a lawyer and have their own office, right? But you have to be a prosecutor. Who's the prosecuting attorney in Washtenaw County? Anybody know? Is it John Worrell? Yeah, so he was just an attorney, not just an attorney, but he was an attorney, right, had his own business. Then he became a prosecuting attorney. Somebody had to vote him into that, had to have some confidence in him. Well, they had confidence in Andrew Jackson, and at the age of 21, he became a prosecuting attorney, which was kind of unusual at that age. And what happens with other attorneys that watch him do this that are older? What do they become? Jealous, yeah. They become jealous because other people that were older that maybe didn't work as hard didn't get to be a prosecutor, and they looked at this guy and they scoffed at him and, you know, kind of made fun of him. And one particular attorney that had more experience than Jackson and scoffed at him was Waitstill Avery. Waitstill Avery was an attorney in Nashville who scoffed at Andrew Jackson, made fun of him. And during a trial in which Waitstill Avery was working against Andrew Jackson, what did Waitstill Avery do? He insulted Andrew Jackson, which is a common thing in today's attorney business, but back in those days it was different. So, during a trial, an attorney by the name of Waitstill Avery insulted Jackson about his lack of experience, and Jackson let his temper get the best of him, which he was world famous to do. And how did he get even? Did he take him out back and they got in a fist fight?
They dueled.
They challenged him to a duel. That's the way you settled things in those days. So Andrew Jackson let his temper get the best of him. He challenged Waitstill Avery to a duel. Now, he was always involved in duels, wasn't he, Dash?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Why was that, do you know? Why did he choose duel all the time?
Because he was a good shot.
Not necessarily. It's a good guess. No, his mother preached to him. Don't write this down, just listen. His mother always said, not to tell lies and don't accept slander. Don't sue for slander, call them out on a duel. Don't sue somebody if they slander your name, call them out on a duel. His mother instilled in him that you didn't tell lies, and you don't accept someone slandering you or insulting you, and if you do, you don't sue them, you call them out on the field in a duel. That was how he was raised. Now, this was one of those things where both men said things in haste, but they had already committed to the duel. So what did they do? Anybody know? They made the decision not to take direct shots. They both met for the duel. They privately agreed not to take direct shots or avoid direct shots. This would save their honor. Neither one of them really wanted to die over this deal. So they put them back to back. They took their respective paces apart. They turned to fire, and both men fired their weapons straight into the air. This would be the only kind duel that he has. He will have another very famous duel later. Now, what historians say is this decision by Jackson to agree to fire into the air and avoid possible death was the first example in his life of him ever controlling his emotions and his temper. He had a bad temper, and historians say this is the first time that they ever were able to see where he controlled his emotions and his temper. Well, backing up, when he first moved to Nashville, Tennessee to be a lawyer, he rented a room in a boarding house. Does anybody know what a boarding house is? You know what the most famous boarding house in history is? The one that Lee Harvey Oswald lived in when he shot President Kennedy. A boarding house is a great big house. This is very common these days, where a widowed woman or an elderly woman would have a great big